So what really forced Japan's surrender? For the longest time, a lot of folks believed the answer was simple. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the sole reason Japan finally threw in the towel. But hold on, because many historians argue there's a second, highly debated factor. We're talking about the sudden entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific War. Some say this was just as important, and maybe even the decisive blow. We're going to break down both of these world-changing shocks.
Part 1. Japan's Desperate Reality.
Okay, to really understand why Japan surrendered, we have to look at the baseline reality they were facing before these two massive shocks even happened. By the summer of 1945, Japan's military and civilian infrastructure was, well, it was in a full-blown crisis. As you'll see illustrated in our animations, their navy was largely destroyed. American submarines were relentlessly cutting off vital supply lines, and devastating U.S. bombing raids had just laid waste to numerous cities. Because of all this, severe food and fuel shortages were sweeping the nation. The country was quite literally in a devastating state of attrition.
Yet despite this absolute crisis, the Japanese leadership was clinging to this one false hope. You see, Japan and the Soviet Union were actually bound by a neutrality pact they signed back in 1941. Because of that, some Japanese leaders were hoping Moscow might step in and act as a mediator in negotiations with the US and its allies. Their ultimate goal? To negotiate a peace that would avoid unconditional surrender and, absolutely crucially, preserve the emperor.
And that brings us to the first paradigm-shifting event, Shock 1, atomic bombs. 2. That's the number of catastrophic atomic bombs dropped by the United States. On August 6, 1945, the first bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. And then, just 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed much of the city of Nagasaki. These attacks caused unprecedented destruction and just an immense loss of life. They demonstrated a terrifying new weapon that was entirely unlike anything anyone had ever seen in the history of warfare. I mean, it sent absolute shockwaves through the Japanese leadership. The sheer scale of the physical devastation sent a really clear, undeniable message. Continued resistance meant nothing but further unimaginable destruction. But right in the middle of these atomic bombings, a second, incredibly sudden event took place. Shock 2, Soviet invasion. Talk about a dramatic, world-altering plot twist. On August 8, 1945, literally right between the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union suddenly broke that 1941 neutrality pact we just talked about. They declared war on Japan. Practically overnight, Japan's supposed diplomatic peace mediator instantly transformed into their newest, highly formidable enemy.
Soviet forces immediately launched a rapid invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. The military offensive was overwhelmingly fast, resulting in the swift defeat of Japan's Kwantung army. But strategically speaking, the biggest blow wasn't just on the battlefield. This sudden invasion instantly eliminated any lingering hope that Moscow would help negotiate a peace settlement. Japan's entire diplomatic strategy was wiped out in a matter of hours.
Japan's strategic situation was suddenly checkmated. As our animated map shows, they were now looking at the horrifying prospect of fighting a two-front war against two major world powers at the exact same time. From the Pacific, they faced the immense might of the United States. And now, advancing from the Asian mainland, they faced the rapid, surging forces of the Soviet Union.
The staggering compression of time here is absolutely crucial to understand. Look how tightly packed these dates are on our animated timeline. August 6th, Hiroshima is bombed. August 8th, the Soviet Union declares war. August 9th, Nagasaki is bombed. And by August 15th, the emperor announces the surrender. The pressure closing in from both sides over just a few short days was sudden, relentless, and absolute.
Which brings us to the core of the historical debate, the surrender debate. Which of these two catastrophic events actually forced the final surrender?
Well, historians are generally divided into two main camps here. On one side, proponents of the atomic bomb theory argue that the unprecedented destructive power of the bombs was the primary, decisive factor. On the other side, historians in the Soviet invasion camp contend that the sudden declaration of war fundamentally changed Japan's strategic calculations. They argue it created a strategic checkmate that eliminated any realistic path to a negotiated settlement. So you have the physical devastation of the bombs on one hand versus the strategic and diplomatic ruin caused by the Soviets on the other.
However, a lot of scholars point to what's known as the combined impact theory. They argue it was actually the rapid one-two punch of these events, happening just days apart, that ultimately convinced Japan their military and diplomatic position was completely untenable. Plus, the Soviet entry spurred massive internal concerns. Japanese leaders feared the very real possibility of a Soviet occupation of parts of Japan or the potential spread of communist influence if the war kept going.
So, how did the Japanese leadership actually respond behind closed doors? Let's look at the emperor's final decision.
What's really fascinating here is that even after both the bombs and the invasion, Japan's Supreme War Council still remained fiercely divided over whether to just keep fighting. Because of this massive deadlock, Emperor Hirohito took a highly unusual step. He personally intervened to break the tie, supporting the acceptance of the Allies' terms. But he did so on one major condition: that the imperial institution itself could be preserved.
Now we need to clarify a really important historical nuance here. While preserving the emperor was absolutely critical to Japan's internal discussions, there is no conclusive historical evidence that Emperor Hirohito surrendered primarily because he personally feared the Soviets would execute him. The preservation of the institution was paramount, for sure, but historians caution against oversimplifying his motives down to just a personal fear of Soviet capture.
As one historian perfectly puts it, whether the decisive factor was the atomic bombings, the Soviet invasion, or the combined impact of both remains one of the most enduring debates in modern history. That impartially summarizes everything we've just unpacked today. The exact final catalyst is still contested by brilliant scholars around the world, but the sheer magnitude of these events, that is absolutely undeniable.
And that leads us to why this history still matters so much today. The legacy of August 1945 literally built the reality of our modern world. Those few intensely debated days reshaped global geopolitical power, they marked the terrifying beginning of the nuclear age, and they finally closed the chapter on the deadliest conflict in human history.
I want to leave you with one final provocative question to think about. How might our understanding of history change depending on which shock was truly the final straw? Think about it. If it was the bombs, the narrative is really about the sheer terror of technology. But if it was the Soviets, it becomes a story of pure geopolitical strategy. It fundamentally shifts how we view the end of the war. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to